This cat saw something in the house that no one else did, and it changed everything. When Daisy rescued Shadow from her porch, she thought she was saving him. She had no idea he was about to save her. What happened next will leave you questioning everything you think you know about the animals we share our homes with. Daisy Mitchell had given up on almost everything. Her last novel had been rejected by 17 publishers, each rejection letter more crushing than the last. Her savings account showed 3 digits that seemed to shrink daily. Her ex-fiancé had left her 6 months ago, taking half their shared belongings and all of her confidence. And at 34, she found herself living alone in a house she'd inherited from a great-aunt she barely remembered meeting twice in her childhood. The inheritance had seemed like a blessing at first, a free place to live while she figured out her life. But the Victorian home on Maple Street felt more like a prison than a refuge. Every room held shadows that seemed too deep, too permanent. The house creaked and groaned at all hours, as if it were slowly collapsing under the weight of its own secrets. The wallpaper in the hallway was particularly unsettling, faded roses that seemed to shift and watch her as she passed. The floorboards groaned with each step, announcing her movements to the empty rooms. Windows rattled in their frames even when there was no wind. The whole place felt heavy with decades of solitude and sorrow. Daisy had been living there for 3 months, surviving on instant coffee and the occasional freelance editing job that barely paid her utilities. Her laptop held 17 different versions of the same chapter, none of them good enough. Writer's block had become her constant companion, more reliable than any human relationship she'd ever had. But loneliness has a way of making desperate decisions seem reasonable. That's why, when she found the scraggly black cat shivering under her porch on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning in October, she didn't hesitate. The poor creature was barely more than skin and bones, with one clouded eye that spoke of old injuries and a torn ear that had healed crooked. His black fur was matted and dull, and he looked like he hadn't eaten in days. "Come on, little guy," she whispered, opening her door wider. The cat looked up at her with his one good eye, and something in that gaze reminded her of her own reflection, tired, weary, but desperately hoping for kindness. "We're both a mess. Might as well be a mess together." She named him Shadow, partly for his color and partly because he seemed to appear and disappear like one. The first 2 weeks were nothing short of magical. Shadow transformed from a frightened, skeletal creature into something resembling a normal cat. His fur began to shine with proper nutrition, and though his clouded eye would never heal completely, his good eye sparkled with intelligence and growing affection. He would curl up beside her laptop as she stared at blank pages, his purring the only sound breaking the oppressive silence of the house. The soft rumble of his contentment became the soundtrack to her days, a constant reminder that she wasn't completely alone in the world. He'd follow her from room to room, a faithful black shadow in her peripheral vision, always within reach but never intrusive. Shadow seemed to understand her moods with an almost supernatural intuition. On days when the rejection letters felt too heavy to bear, he'd curl up in her lap and purr until the tightness in her chest loosened. When she paced the floors in frustration over a stubborn paragraph, he'd watch from doorways with patient eyes, as if he knew the creative process required both time and space. For the first time in months, Daisy felt like she might actually survive this low point in her life. The house felt less oppressive with Shadow in it. His presence made the Victorian's quirks seem charming rather than menacing. Even the watching wallpaper felt less judgmental when a small black cat was keeping her company. But then something changed. And it changed everything. It started so subtly that Daisy almost missed it. Shadow would stop mid-stride in the hallway, his newly sleek fur suddenly standing on end as he stared at absolutely nothing. His good eye would track something invisible moving across the wall, following a path that made sense only to him. His head would tilt slightly, ears rotating like tiny radar dishes trying to pick up a signal that existed beyond human perception. "What is it, boy?" Daisy would ask, following his intense gaze to empty corners and bare walls, her voice echoing strangely in the quiet house. But there was never anything there. Just shadows and dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. At first, she dismissed it as typical cat behavior. Everyone knew cats could be strange, fixating on invisible specks of dust or mysterious sounds only they could hear. But Shadow's behavior felt different, more purposeful, more urgent. The incidents grew more frequent and more intense. Shadow began spending long minutes staring at specific spots throughout the house, his body rigid with attention. He developed a particular fascination with the living room entrance, where he would sometimes stop and refuse to proceed further. One morning, Daisy found him sitting perfectly still in the hallway, staring at the wall where a family portrait had once hung. The nail was still there, but the picture had been removed long before she moved in. Shadow's tail twitched rhythmically, and his ears were pressed forward with laser focus. "There's nothing there, Shadow," she said gently, reaching down to pet him. But the moment her fingers touched his fur, she felt it too, a strange coolness in the air, as if someone had opened a window somewhere in the house. The sensation lasted only a moment, but it was unmistakable. The behavior escalated rapidly over the following days. Shadow began hissing at the living room entrance, his back arching in a perfect Halloween cat pose as he refused to enter. The sounds he made weren't the typical cat hisses she was familiar with. These were deeper, more guttural warnings that seemed to come from somewhere primal and ancient. They made the hair on her arms stand up. "Come on, Shadow," she'd coax, trying to encourage him into the room. But he would plant his feet firmly at the threshold, his claws digging into the hardwood floor, absolutely refusing to cross that invisible line. The living room had become enemy territory in Shadow's mind, and nothing Daisy did could convince him otherwise. Then came the night that changed everything. Daisy woke from a restless sleep to find Shadow sitting perfectly still at the foot of her bed, his silhouette clearly defined against the pale moonlight filtering through her bedroom curtains. His posture was unnaturally rigid, every muscle tensed with attention as he stared intently at the bedroom door. His tail gave a single, sharp twitch. Then another. That's when she heard it. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to pause between each movement, as if whoever was walking was trying to be quiet but couldn't quite manage it. The old floorboards announced each step with their familiar groans and creaks, sounds Daisy had grown accustomed to hearing when she moved through the house herself. But she wasn't moving. She was lying in bed, frozen with terror. Daisy's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was sure the sound would give her away to whoever was in her hallway. Her mouth went dry, and her hands began to shake beneath the covers. She lived alone. Every door was locked before she went to bed. She developed an almost obsessive routine of checking them twice. But those footsteps were real. She could hear the ancient wood protesting under someone's weight, could almost feel the vibrations through the floor. Shadow's ears flattened against his head, and he crept toward the door with deliberate stealth. His movements were completely silent, each paw placed with the precision of a predator. He positioned himself directly between Daisy and whatever was in the hallway, his body language screaming protective determination. The footsteps continued their slow progression down the hall, growing closer to her bedroom door. Daisy could track their movement by the sequence of creaking boards, past the bathroom, past the linen closet, approaching her sanctuary. Then they stopped. Directly outside her bedroom. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the footsteps had been. Daisy could feel a presence on the other side of the door, could sense someone standing there in the darkness. Her breathing sounded impossibly loud in the quiet room, and she tried desperately to control it. Shadow remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the door handle. In the moonlight, Daisy could see his fur standing on end, making him appear twice his normal size. Minutes passed. Or maybe hours. Time seemed to stretch and distort in the darkness. Finally, Daisy gathered enough courage to grab the baseball bat she'd started keeping beside her bed, a recent addition that now seemed prophetic rather than paranoid. Her movements felt clumsy and loud, but Shadow didn't react, maintaining his vigilant stance. She crept toward the door, her bare feet silent on the cold hardwood. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle, and she had to grip the bat tighter to keep from dropping it. Taking a deep breath, she yanked the door open with sudden violence. The hallway was empty. Completely, utterly empty. But the air felt different. Disturbed. Like someone had just passed through moments before, leaving behind the faintest trace of their presence. There was an odd scent too, something she couldn't quite identify. Not cologne or aftershave, but something more subtle. The smell of someone else's house, maybe, or clothing that had been stored for too long. "I'm losing my mind," she whispered to Shadow, who continued staring down the dark corridor with unblinking intensity. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. Something was happening in this house. Something that Shadow had been trying to warn her about for weeks. The incidents multiplied with terrifying frequency. Objects would move when she wasn't looking, books shifting position on shelves, coffee cups sliding across counters with no explanation, picture frames found tilted at odd angles. She'd find doors standing open that she distinctly remembered closing, and sometimes she'd discover lights turned on in rooms she hadn't entered for days. Each morning brought new evidence that someone, or something, was moving through her house at night. A kitchen chair pushed away from the table. Bathroom towels rearranged. Her reading glasses moved from the nightstand to the kitchen counter. The most unsettling discovery came on a Thursday morning when she found muddy footprints on her kitchen floor, footprints that were definitely not hers. They were larger, made by boots or heavy shoes, and they traced a path from the back door to the living room. The back door that had been locked when she went to bed. The back door that was still locked when she woke up. And always, Shadow was there. Watching. Warning. His behavior had become her early warning system, and she'd learned to pay attention to his signals. When his first stood up, she knew to be alert. When he positioned himself between her and a particular area, she knew to avoid it. Her writing suffered completely. How could she focus on fictional mysteries when her own life had become one? The laptop screen remained blank for hours as she found herself drawn instead to watching Shadow's reactions, trying to decode what he was sensing that she couldn't. But perhaps that was the point. For the first time in months, Daisy felt genuinely curious about something. Terrified, yes, but also alive with purpose in a way she hadn't experienced since her writing career had stalled. She began researching the house's history with the dedication she'd once reserved for her novels. The county records office became her second home. She pored over property deeds, tax records, and newspaper archives, building a timeline of everyone who had lived at 247 Maple Street. The house had been built in 1923 by a successful businessman named Thomas Whitmore. It had passed through several families over the decades, most staying for only a few years. But the most recent owner had been different. Eleanor Morwen had lived in the house for 23 years, from 1996 until 2019. The records showed that she'd lived alone for the final 20 years, after her husband moved out following their divorce in 1999. The divorce had been bitter and public, according to the newspaper archives Daisy found. Frank Morwen had been a prominent local attorney, and Eleanor had been a retired schoolteacher. The divorce proceedings had dragged on for 2 years, with accusations flying from both sides. But what caught Daisy's attention was what happened after the divorce was finalized. Eleanor Morwen had simply vanished one day in April 2019. According to the police reports she managed to access through a helpful clerk at the station, Eleanor's disappearance had been treated as a missing person case initially. She'd failed to show up for her weekly bridge game, missed a doctor's appointment, and left her car in the driveway with the keys still in the ignition. Mysterious disappearance of local woman remains unsolved, read a newspaper headline from May 2019. The article described Eleanor as a quiet, reliable woman who had lived alone peacefully for years and noted that police have found no evidence of foul play, though the investigation remains open. The case had gone cold within 6 months. "That's strange," Daisy murmured to Shadow, who sat beside her purring, the first time he'd seemed truly relaxed in weeks. "She lived here for over 20 years, and then just disappeared?" That night, she dreamed vividly of a woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a lavender cardigan and pearls. The woman stood in the living room, the room Shadow refused to enter, pointing frantically at the wall behind the old mahogany bookshelf. Her mouth was moving as if she were trying to speak, but no sound came out. Her eyes were desperate, pleading. In the dream, the woman kept pointing and pointing, becoming increasingly agitated when Daisy couldn't understand what she was trying to communicate. The woman's image began to fade, becoming translucent, but her pointing never stopped. Daisy woke with a gasp, her heart racing and her nightgown damp with perspiration. Shadow was gone. Panic gripped her chest immediately. In the weeks since his strange behavior had begun, Shadow had never left her side at night. He'd become her constant guardian, always within arm's reach when she slept. She searched the house frantically, calling his name in urgent whispers, until she found him in the living room, the room he'd been steadfastly avoiding for weeks. He was pawing at the wall behind the bookshelf, making soft chirping sounds she'd never heard from him before. His movements were deliberate and focused, as if he were trying to dig through the wallpaper itself. The exact spot the woman in her dream had been pointing to. "What is it, boy?" Daisy knelt beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. Shadow looked up at her with his good eye, then returned to pawing at the wall. This time, she noticed something she'd missed before. His claws were actually making small tears in the wallpaper. Daisy examined the wall more closely, running her hands over the surface. The wallpaper here was different from the rest of the room, slightly newer, with a pattern that didn't quite match the surrounding area. It had been hung to cover something. She pressed her palm against the wall and felt something that made her breath catch. A hollow space. Her heart raced as she carefully peeled back a corner of the mismatched wallpaper. Shadow sat back on his haunches, watching intently as if he'd been waiting for this moment for weeks. Underneath the wallpaper was a small wooden panel, no bigger than a hardcover book, set flush with the wall. It had been concealed so carefully that no one would ever notice it unless they were specifically looking, or unless a determined cat had guided them there. The panel had tiny hinges on one side and was secured with a simple latch that had been painted over multiple times. Daisy's hands shook as she worked the latch free. The panel swung open with a soft creak, revealing a hidden compartment carved into the wall itself. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age and its cover worn smooth by handling. Beside it was a small manila envelope and what appeared to be several photographs. Before we continue, don't forget to like the video and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Daisy's hands shook as she opened the journal. The first page was inscribed in elegant handwriting. Property of Eleanor Morwen. The entries began innocuously enough: daily observations, grocery lists, thoughts about gardening. But as Daisy read deeper, the tone shifted dramatically. March 15, 2019, he was here again today. Frank. Watching the house from his car across the street. It's been 3 years since the divorce was finalized, but he can't seem to let go. The restraining order means nothing to him. March 20th. 2019, found my spare key missing. I know I left it under the third flower pot. He's been inside. I can feel it. Things are moved just slightly. The coffee cup facing the wrong direction. My reading glasses not where I left them. March 25th, 2019, I'm scared. Really scared. Frank called me yesterday, said he knew things about me that could destroy my reputation. Things that aren't even true. But who would believe me over him? He was always so charming to everyone else. Daisy's blood ran cold as she continued reading. Eleanor's ex-husband, Frank Morwen, had been stalking her systematically. The journal detailed months of psychological torment, threatening phone calls, break-ins, constant surveillance. But the final entries were the most disturbing. April 2nd, 2019, he knows about the money. About what I found in his office before the divorce. The evidence of what he did to that poor girl, Rachel Thornfield, 5 years ago. I should have gone to the police then, but I was too afraid. Now he says if I ever tell anyone, he'll make sure I disappear just like she did. April 5th, 2019, this might be my last entry. Frank came by today. Said we needed to work things out once and for all. He's coming back tonight. I'm hiding this journal where he'll never find it. If something happens to me, I need someone to know the truth. Frank Morwen killed Rachel Thornfield in 2014. And I'm afraid I'm next. The journal ended there. Daisy sat in stunned silence, Shadow purring softly beside her. Eleanor hadn't simply disappeared, she'd been murdered. And her killer was still out there. She fumbled for her phone to call the police, but froze when she heard a sound that made her blood turn to ice. A car door slamming outside. Footsteps on her front porch. Shadow's fur stood on end. He leaped down from the couch and positioned himself between Daisy and the living room entrance, that same protective stance she'd seen dozens of times. 3 slow knocks echoed through the house. Daisy crept to the window and peered through the curtains. A tall, silver-haired man stood on her porch. He looked exactly like the photos of Frank Morwen she'd found in the police reports. He was supposed to be 73 years old. But he looked strong. Dangerous. And he was staring directly at her window. Her phone had no signal, something that had never happened before. The landline was dead. Frank had cut the lines. Another knock. More insistent this time. "I know you're in there, Miss Mitchell," came a voice that was terrifyingly calm. "I saw your light on. We need to talk." Daisy's mind raced. How did he know her name? How long had he been watching her? I'm a reasonable man, Frank continued. I just want to have a conversation about what you might have found in my late ex-wife's house. Something that belongs to me. Shadow crept closer to the front door, every muscle tensed. A low growl rumbled from his throat, not the confused sounds he'd been making for weeks, but something primal and protective. The doorknob rattled. Frank was trying to get in. Daisy grabbed the journal and her phone, praying she could get a signal elsewhere in the house. She crept toward the back door, Shadow following close behind. But as she reached for the handle, she heard the unmistakable sound of glass breaking. Frank was inside. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, his voice echoed through the house. I've been watching you for weeks. I know you live alone. I know your routines. No one will look for you for days. Shadow suddenly darted away from Daisy, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. For a moment, she felt completely abandoned. Then she heard Frank curse loudly from the living room. Damn cat. There was a crash, like furniture being overturned. Shadow was creating a distraction. Daisy used the opportunity to slip out the back door into the night. She ran toward her neighbor's house, clutching the journal to her chest. But she was too late. Frank's silhouette appeared at the corner of the house, blocking her path. In the moonlight, she could see he was holding something, a knife that gleamed silver. Eleanor made the same mistake, he said, walking slowly toward her. Thought she could run. Thought someone would save her. Daisy backed against the garden shed, trapped. The police will. The police didn't care about Eleanor. They won't care about you either. Another writer who couldn't handle the isolation. Tragic suicide. He raised the knife. That's when Shadow struck. The cat launched himself from somewhere in the darkness, landing squarely on Frank's back with all claws extended. Frank screamed, dropping the knife as he tried to tear the cat away from him. Run! Daisy didn't waste the opportunity. She sprinted toward the street, shouting for help at the top of her lungs. Behind her, Frank was still struggling with Shadow, cursing and stumbling in the dark. Mrs. Peterson, her elderly neighbor, appeared at her door with a shotgun. I already called 911, she shouted. Get over here! Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Frank made one last attempt to flee, but Shadow wasn't finished. The cat had positioned himself directly in Frank's path, hissing and spitting, herding him back toward the house like a tiny, furious sheepdog. When the police arrived, they found Frank Morwen cowered in Daisy's backyard, bleeding from dozens of claw marks, with a very determined black cat standing guard over him. The journal provided everything the police needed. Eleanor's body was eventually found buried in Frank's backyard. Rachel Thornfield's remains were discovered in a wooded area outside town, exactly where Eleanor had indicated in her notes. Frank Morwen was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. But the story didn't end there. During Frank's trial, more evidence emerged. He had been stalking Daisy for weeks, ever since she'd moved into Eleanor's house. He'd been the source of the mysterious footsteps, the moving objects, the feeling of being watched. He'd even been drugging Shadow's food with mild sedatives left on the porch, trying to keep the cat from interfering with his surveillance. But Shadow had developed an immunity to the drugs, and more importantly, he'd developed an unshakable bond with Daisy. The veterinarian who examined Shadow after the incident was amazed. Cats are incredibly intuitive, she explained. Shadow sensed danger before anyone else did. His behavior wasn't random, it was protective. He was trying to warn Daisy and guide her to the truth. 6 months later, Daisy published her book about the experience. The Cat Who Knew became a bestseller, but more importantly, it helped solve 3 other cold cases involving Frank Morwin. Shadow fully recovered from his ordeal and never showed signs of strange behavior again. He seemed to understand that his job was done, his human was safe. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, Daisy would catch him staring thoughtfully at the wall where Eleanor's journal had been hidden. Almost as if he could still sense her presence. Grateful. Peaceful. Finally at rest. The house on Maple Street felt different now. Lighter. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted completely, replaced by warmth and contentment. And Daisy never rode alone again. Shadow was always there, curled beside her laptop, purring softly as she crafted new stories. He'd found his purpose in protecting her. And she'd found hers in telling the stories that needed to be told. Sometimes the most extraordinary heroes come in the smallest packages. Sometimes salvation arrives on 4 paws and a damaged eye, with nothing but love and an unshakable determination to protect what matters most. Eleanor Morwin's spirit could finally rest, knowing that justice had been served. And Frank Morwin learned that some secrets are too powerful to stay buried, especially when there's a determined cat standing guard over the truth. Thank you for watching. If you liked it, please leave a like and subscribe for more.